On the morning of April 3rd, 1952, the city of Lyon stirred awake beneath a blanket of soft spring fog. The streets glistened from a night of gentle rain, and a pale sun struggled to rise above the terracotta rooftops. In the heart of the Presqu'île district, where cafes opened their shutters and the river Saône breathed mist into the dawn, a familiar voice warmed up behind the cracked windows of a modest apartment overlooking Rue St. George's. It was the voice that had once stopped patrons mid-conversation, that had floated effortlessly through velvet-curtained opera halls, that critics described as the thunder within the storm. It belonged to Étienne Morel, 41 years old, celebrated French tenor, and a man whose presence commanded every stage he walked onto. To the public, Étienne was a rising star poised for international acclaim. To his neighbors, he was the polite gentleman who carried fresh bread home each morning and tipped his hat to passers-by. To his colleagues, he was a perfectionist who rehearsed until the early hours. But on this morning there was something different, a noticeable heaviness in his movements, a brief, distracted pause before he locked the apartment door. A glance upward toward the cathedral towers looming beyond the fog, as if searching for something or bracing for something unseen. He had been preparing for the biggest performance of his career, a revival of Les Anges Silencia at the Théâtre des Célestins. It was scheduled for that very evening. Every seat had been sold. The press had circled the date. His voice was the centerpiece of the show. Yet as he walked toward the theater shortly after noon, witnesses would later recall a faint tremor in his hands. A moment where he stopped beside a bakery window, staring not at the pastries but at his own reflection, as though analyzing a face he no longer recognized. One woman swore he whispered something under his breath, something like "not again," before continuing on. By late afternoon, he was seen entering the theater for final rehearsals. Musicians tuned their instruments, stagehands adjusted lighting, and the director paced with anxious energy. Étienne arrived exactly on time, coat folded over his arm, sheet music tucked beneath it. He greeted everyone with his usual warmth, though his eyes carried the weight of an unspoken worry. Rehearsal proceeded flawlessly. His voice soared through the empty auditorium, filling the hall with a brilliance that left even the crew momentarily stunned. But when the final note faded, Étienne lingered on the stage, staring at the grand chandelier above as if caught in a trance. "Are you all right?" the conductor asked. Étienne smiled, but it was thin, fragile. "Just nerves," he said. "Tonight is important." Those would be some of the last words anyone heard from him. When the clock struck 7:40 p.m., only 20 minutes before curtain call, Étienne disappeared from the backstage corridor. His costume hung untouched. His shoes remained neatly placed beside the dressing table. His warm-up tea still steamed. No one had seen him leave, no one had heard a struggle. It was as though he had stepped out of time, vanishing from the busiest part of the theater on the most important night of his life. Within the hour, panic overtook confusion. Police were notified. The performance was canceled. Dozens of patrons demanded answers. Rumors swirled like sparks from a struck match. And somewhere above the city, high in the stone towers of Lyon Cathedral, a bell would toll at precisely 9:00 p.m., a deep, resonant note that would later haunt investigators for decades. At the time, no one imagined the truth. No one suspected where his voice, the voice that once filled every hall, would be found 72 years later. The announcement that Étienne Morel had vanished spread through the Théâtre des Célestins with a quiet, growing dread, like a draft of cold air slipping under a locked door. Minutes before the curtain was meant to rise, the stage manager called for him again and again. No reply. The cast whispered urgently in the halls. The conductor tapped the edge of his baton against his palm, packing in small, tight circles. Inside the dressing room, the scene felt undisturbed. His wardrobe remained untouched, the dark velvet costume waiting for him like a ghost of the performance that would never begin. His tea, still warm, rested on the dressing table. The top sheet of his score lay open to Act II, where the tenor's most challenging aria awaited. Nothing suggested haste. Nothing suggested fear. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no shards of glass, no broken latch on the window. It was as if he had stepped out to adjust something backstage and simply never returned. The police arrived before 9:00 p.m. The director repeated the same statement, voice trembling. He was here at rehearsal. He said he needed a moment to himself. He walked down the east corridor, and he never came back. Witness interviews painted a fragmented timeline. A violinist claimed she heard footsteps heading toward the stage-left exit. A makeup artist said she saw Étienne moments earlier, his expression unusually pale. A stagehand thought he heard someone humming softly, distantly near the props room, though he couldn't be sure if it was Étienne at all. Each statement offered a thread, yet none wove into a clear picture. By midnight, officers conducted a full sweep of the vast theater. Every corridor, every balcony, every maintenance hall, every locked room. They searched beneath the stage among the storage crates and dusty painted backdrops. They ventured into the catacombs of the lower mechanical levels where old wooden pulleys creaked like ancient bones. Nothing. Outside the building, rain had begun to fall again in thin, cold strands. Flashlights swept across alleys, doorways, and cobblestone paths. Not a single footprint, not a single dropped item. It was as though Étienne had dissolved into the night air. His family arrived at dawn. His sister, Colette, stood on the front steps of the theater, clutching her coat tightly at her chest, refusing to believe the words the officers repeated. "We don't know where he went. We can't find any trace. He may have left voluntarily." Voluntarily. No one who knew Étienne believed that. In the following 24 hours, newspapers reported the disappearance with urgency and disbelief. Le Grand Tenor Mécanu, where is Étienne Morel? Crowds gathered outside the theater demanding answers. Fans lit candles beneath the posters of his last performance. Some wrote messages along the walls, pleas for his return. And above the city, the cathedral bell tolled again the next morning at 6:00 a.m. Few noticed it then. No one connected it to him yet. The official search began at sunrise on April 4th, only hours after Étienne was first reported missing. The police launched a citywide effort, mapping the last confirmed sightings and constructing what they believed to be the tenor's path. Officers walked the narrow streets around the theater, questioning cafe owners, tram drivers, night shift workers, and anyone who might have spotted a lone figure in the rain. The first lead came from a baker in Place des Célestins who said he saw Étienne walk across the square shortly after 7:30 p.m. He looked troubled, the man recalled. Like he was listening to something far away. When pressed, he admitted he wasn't entirely sure. It could have been someone else, but the silhouette struck him as familiar. Investigators followed that thread only to reach another dead end. No other witnesses reported seeing him leave the area. No tram tickets were purchased. No cab drivers reported a passenger matching his description. No one saw him cross either of the river bridges leading out of the district. Tracker dogs were brought in that afternoon. They picked up his scent inside the theater but repeatedly lost it at the same exact location, the East Corridor, only meters from the dressing rooms. Each dog reacted the same way, following his trail down the hall, pausing near a small maintenance door, then circling in confusion before wandering back. It made no sense. Étienne was a public figure. He could not have simply vanished within a building packed with performers, crew, and staff. False leads multiplied. A woman claimed she spotted him boarding a train heading toward Paris. 2 teenagers reported hearing someone singing near the riverbank. An elderly man insisted he saw Étienne enter the cathedral late that night, though the doors had been locked and the claim was dismissed as unreliable. The Morel family grew increasingly desperate. Colette urged the police to expand their search. She posted notices throughout the city pleading for information. She met with journalists begging them not to let the case fade from public memory. Every day felt heavier than the last. Every night stretched into a long corridor of unanswered questions. And still, the cathedral bell rang each morning with unwavering regularity. Police eventually inspected the cathedral grounds, if only to eliminate another possibility. They searched the nave, the sacristy, the crypt, and the surrounding gardens. They climbed the stairs into the lower levels of the bell towers but stopped before reaching the upper platforms, assuming there was nothing of interest there. They had no reason to suspect the bells themselves could hide anything. The chambers were sealed by heavy metal casings. The idea of a person being inside one was unthinkable. By the end of the first week, the momentum of the search began to slow. Officers returned to their regular assignments. Volunteers drifted home, news articles shrank in size, and the public's attention turned elsewhere. But for the family, and for the conductor, the castmates, the stagehands, the man who tuned the theater's grand piano, the loss was not something that could fade. Étienne had vanished without a single clue, without a single explanation, without a single goodbye. The city carried on. But within the Morel home, the silence grew louder with each passing day. And high above it all, the cathedral bell continued to toll, its deep, resonant voice echoing across Lyon, unaware of the secret it guarded. In the weeks that followed Étienne Morel's disappearance, the city of Lyon carried a quiet ache beneath its daily routine. Posters bearing his photograph weathered under the spring sun, their corners curling, colors fading. The opera house resumed its performances with a different tenor, though audiences reported a strange emptiness lingering in the air, a sense that something irreplaceable had been removed from the heart of the city. For his family, the silence that settled over their home was a different kind of grief. His sister Colette continued to place a fresh candle in her window every night, a small flame burning against the darkness in hopes that he might somehow find his way back. Étienne's mother, already frail, would sit by the radio each morning, waiting for news. The updates never came. The police investigation gradually slowed, then stalled. By the end of 1952, the case file had grown thick with interviews, maps, photographs, and handwritten statements, yet every page repeated the same absence of answers. Detectives cycled through theories, but none brought clarity. They speculated about voluntary disappearance, artistic breakdowns, secret debts, the pressure of fame, yet no evidence supported any explanation. The years marched forward. 3 years became 5, 5 became 10. Eventually, the case transitioned from active inquiry to archival storage, tucked away in a cabinet with hundreds of other unsolved files. It became the kind of mystery people referenced briefly and then abandoned, too unsettling to dwell upon, too confusing to solve. Theories, however, never fully disappeared. Some believed Étienne had been lured into the night by someone he trusted. Others argued he suffered a sudden psychological collapse. A few pointed to a former rival, a baritone known for his jealous temperament, but no motive, no witness, and no physical trace ever emerged. Each theory rose, flickered, and faded into the quiet fog that had swallowed the tenor himself. Only one rumor persisted with unusual stubbornness. It began with the elderly man who claimed, during the first week of the search, that he saw Étienne entering Lyon Cathedral on the night he vanished. At the time, police dismissed the account entirely. The doors had been locked after evening mass, and there was no evidence anyone had entered thereafter. Yet the man repeated the same detail for years. He looked like a man following a voice, he insisted, like he heard something calling him. Most chalked it up to confusion, to the hazy intersections of memory and imagination. But in small circles, especially among the city's older residents, the idea sparked a peculiar folklore, that something in the cathedral had drawn him up the towers, toward the bells whose tones had marked every hour of Lyon's long history. The tides of time washed over the city. The 1960s swept in new music, new politics, new lives. The 1970s brought economic strain, rebuilt neighborhoods, modernized transportation. Children born the year Étienne vanished grew into adults who knew little of him beyond his name printed on old vinyl records and sepia posters displayed in antique shops. For the Morel family, life moved unevenly. Étienne's mother passed away in 1968, never knowing what happened to her son. Colette raised her own children, telling them stories of their uncle, the brilliance of his voice, the promise he carried, the smile that warmed rooms. She kept his sheet music stored in a small cedar box, opening it only on his birthday. Each year, she prayed for an answer that never came. Investigators revisited the case twice. Once in 1977, sparked by a witness who claimed to have seen a man matching Étienne's description in Marseille, and again in 1992, after a local historian noticed irregularities in the original map of the theater's underground passages. Both inquiries ended the same way, quietly, without conclusion. By the early 2000s, the disappearance of Étienne Morel had become a footnote in Lyon's cultural history. True crime enthusiasts occasionally discussed it in forums. Opera scholars referenced him briefly as the lost tenor of Lyon. Journalists wrote retrospective articles each decade, noting the eeriness of a man disappearing so completely that not even a scrap of fabric or misplaced shoe had been found. But the city had changed. The cathedral had undergone restorations. Cranes dotted the skyline. New generations filled the cafes where Étienne once bought his morning bread. The world moved forward as it always does. Still, one strange detail endured. The cathedral bell, Massif du Ciel, cast in 1848, continued to toll with perfect consistency, its sound deep and resonant. Workers who tended the bell remarked that its tone was unusually warm for a bronze instrument of its age. They never questioned why. They never looked beyond the surface of the ancient metal. No one imagined the hollow chamber inside the bell was not empty. No one knew that 72 years of silence were hiding something that had once been full of life, full of promise, full of music. The truth waited suspended above the city, sealed in bronze, swaying gently with every hour. On the morning of June 12, 2024, 72 years after Étienne Morel vanished, a team of restoration specialists gathered inside the South Tower of Lyon Cathedral. The bell Massif du Ciel had been scheduled for structural assessment after engineers detected unusual vibration patterns during routine acoustic testing. Though the bell still tolled with remarkable clarity, its age made inspections essential. What began as a standard maintenance procedure would soon unravel one of France's most enduring mysteries. The day was warm, with sunlight slicing through the stained glass windows and casting fractured ribbons of color across the stone floors. Dust motes drifted in the beams like drifting stars. The tower staircase, spiraling upward in tight stone coils, echoed with the workers' footsteps as they ascended toward the upper platforms, an area rarely visited, reserved for only the most specialized tasks. Lead technician Olivier Saunier reached the bell first. He paused before approaching it, admiring its size. Nearly 4 tons of bronze hung suspended by an aging wooden yoke, the enormous clapper resting against its inner wall like a pendulum frozen in time. Generations of cathedral workers had tended to this instrument, few ever imagining that it might hold more than hollow air within its walls. Their goal was simple: evaluate microfractures and measure internal resonance changes. They began with external scanning equipment, expecting to record uniform density. But as the instrument swept across the bell's lower hemisphere, the readings dipped sharply. A cavity anomaly. At first, they assumed it to be a miscalibration, but repeated scans confirmed the same irregularity and internal mass inconsistent with the composition of bronze. Something was inside the bell. Olivier felt a faint chill. "Is it debris from the casting?" one technician asked. "Impossible," another replied. "The cavity isn't random, this is symmetrical." They needed to look inside. Removing the lower maintenance panel required delicate precision. The bell's casing was reinforced with bolts untouched for decades. Each turn of the wrench echoed through the chamber, the sound resonant and strangely mournful. When the final bolt released, a metallic groan filled the tower. The panel opened, and the workers stepped back in horror. Within the hollow darkness, illuminated only by the shaft of sunlight from Olivier's lantern, lay the preserved remains of a human being. Positioned upright, knees drawn slightly inward, head bowed. As though listening. As though waiting for a note that never came. The air turned still, no one spoke, no one moved. The silence felt ancient, sacred, dreadful. Olivier whispered the words that would soon appear in headlines across the world. "Mon Dieu, there's someone inside." Authorities were contacted immediately. The cathedral closed within the hour. Yellow tape sealed off the entrances. Police units formed a perimeter around the square, sending tourists away with hurried explanations. Forensic investigators climbed the tower steps with steady, reverent movements. The interior of the bell was examined slowly, methodically. The preservation was startling. The cool, sealed environment had protected the remains for decades, leaving clothing fibers, bone positioning, and even traces of fabric stitching intact. A tattered cloth rested near the ribs, the remains of a dark velvet garment resembling an opera costume. When investigators reached the small wooden box nestled at the bell's base, their breath caught. Inside it lay a folded piece of paper. Time had yellowed its edges, but the ink remained legible. It was sheet music. Handwritten. Étienne Morel's signature marked the bottom corner. Forensic analysis revealed no evidence of struggle, no fractures suggesting an attempt to escape, no markings indicating bonds or restraints. Everything suggested he had entered the chamber alive, voluntarily, or under the belief he must. A mystery growing within a revelation. The sealed interior preserved more than bones. The investigators found fingernail scraping along the inner bronze surface, light, hesitant, as though he had touched the walls not in panic but in recognition. His hands had been positioned near his chest, gentle, peaceful. The posture resembled a singer preparing to draw breath. News of the discovery spread at the speed of light. Television crews filled the streets. Reporters gathered near the cathedral gates, broadcasting urgent updates. The Morel family, 3 generations removed, received the call that would change the story of their lineage forever. Lyon had not forgotten the tenor who vanished, but no one, not even the most imaginative folklorists, had ever imagined this. The opera singer who spent his life filling grand halls with his voice had rested for 72 years inside a bell, an instrument that echoed across the city every day, carrying its sound above rooftops, down the riverbanks, through the narrow alleys where Étienne once walked. For decades the bell had tolled. For decades, the city listened. And for decades, unbeknownst to all, the man whose voice once soared above orchestras had been suspended inside the very object that replaced him. The breakthrough was not just a discovery. It was a reckoning, a revelation waiting in bronze and silence. The forensic investigation unfolded with a gravity usually reserved for national tragedies. Specialists from across France converged on Lyon, each bringing expertise in skeletal analysis, historical garment preservation, cathedral architecture, and mid-20th century forensic methods. Their task: reconstruct what had happened to Étienne Morel in the spring of 1952, why he vanished, how he ended up inside the cathedral bell, and what compelled him to remain there until his final breath. The remains were carefully transported to a laboratory where, for the first time in 72 years, the story began to speak again. Preliminary findings were clear: Étienne had not been murdered. No fractures, no signs of blunt force trauma, no defensive wounds. Toxicology revealed no traces of poison. There were no restraints, no ropes, no evidence of forced confinement. His final hours appeared calm, unnervingly so. What investigators did find was a small fracture in the right ankle, consistent with a misstep or fall. Combined with the altitude of the bell tower and the treacherous climb required to reach its uppermost chamber, it suggested that Étienne had injured himself ascending the tower. Once inside the bell's cavity, weakened by pain and exhaustion, he may have become unable to descend. The sealed panel likely closed behind him or had been partially damaged, creating an enclosure he could not escape. But the question remained: why would a man on the verge of the greatest performance of his career climb into a cathedral bell tower? The answer emerged from the handwriting analysis of the sheet music found inside the bell. The score was not one of Étienne's typical rehearsal sheets. It was a modification, an aria rewritten for a single voice with markings indicating unusual acoustics. Along the margins, he had scribbled personal notes. The resonance, unlike anything I've heard. The bell carries the tone upward, pure, unbroken. I need to hear it myself, alone. A second sheet, partially damaged by time, held an even more haunting phrase. If I sing here, perhaps I will understand what the cathedral hears. Investigators pieced together a chilling but plausible sequence. Étienne, chasing the perfect acoustic environment, had gone to the cathedral that evening, perhaps drawn by an idea that had consumed him for days. The cathedral bell tower, known for its dense reverberation, may have seemed like the ideal place to test the aria that troubled him during rehearsal. Singers often described Étienne as obsessive when preparing for a role. He once spent a night alone in an abandoned railway station experimenting with echoes. Another time, he practiced in an empty cistern to study resonance. The man pursued perfection with a devotion bordering on spiritual. It was not far-fetched to imagine him seeking the ultimate acoustical chamber, the inside of a cathedral bell. There was a narrow span of time between the end of rehearsal and the beginning of the performance, just enough for him to slip away unnoticed, make his way to the cathedral, convince a caretaker to unlock the side door, or find an existing entry through a maintenance stair. Then the fall. The injury. The enclosure. He had not been trapped by someone else. He had been trapped by his own pursuit. The forensic anthropologist leading the case summarized it in a single sentence that later echoed through news reports. Étienne Morel did not flee his life, he followed his voice. The mystery of the missing tenor, debated, romanticized, feared, was not the result of violence, conspiracy, or betrayal. It was the tragic fate of an artist whose devotion to his craft led him higher and higher until he reached a place from which he could not return. The truth was devastating. And yet, it brought a strange peace to those who had waited decades for answers. The announcement of the discovery sent ripples of emotion through Lyon. Crowds gathered outside the cathedral, laying flowers at its steps. Musicians played softly near the entrance, filling the square with hymns and arias once sung by Étienne. For the first time in decades, the city felt united in a shared, solemn reverence. Colette Morel, now in her 80s, arrived at the cathedral 2 days after the public briefing. Her hands shook as she was guided to a quiet seating area near the nave. For years she had imagined dozens of endings for her brother. None resembled the truth she received that day. Yet as she listened to investigators describe his final hours, tears streamed down her face, not from horror but from relief. He wasn't alone, she whispered. He was where he loved to be, surrounded by sound. A memorial service was held inside the cathedral under the very bells that had guarded Étienne's silence for 72 years. The choir performed his favorite hymn. Musicians played his most beloved opera selections. Visitors described a strange sensation as the music filled the space, an echo that seemed to travel upward toward the towers as though returning to him. The bell Massif du Ciel was temporarily silenced. It would not ring again until after the service when Colette requested a single toll in his honor. The sound that followed was unlike any the city had heard before, deep, resonant, trembling with significance. People in the square stopped walking, birds scattered from rooftops. Shopkeepers stepped outside and removed their hats. It felt, if only for a moment, like the voice of Étienne had returned to the world. His remains were interred in a modest plot overlooking the Saône River, close to where he once lingered after rehearsals. On his headstone, the family engraved a simple phrase: "He followed the music." In the months that followed, the cathedral opened a small exhibit dedicated to him. It displayed his restored sheet music, a photograph from his last rehearsal, and a timeline of the search that spanned 7 decades. Visitors often paused the longest in front of the recreated notes he wrote about the bell's resonance, his final thoughts on the art that defined his life. The Morel family, once bound by uncertainty, began to find peace. Colette's grandchildren spoke proudly of the great-uncle they never met. Scholars revisited Étienne's legacy, producing new biographies and documentaries honoring his contributions to French opera. His recordings, long forgotten, returned to circulation, streaming online to new audiences who discovered the beauty and tragedy of his story. And Lyon Cathedral itself became an enduring symbol of his fate. Pilgrims and tourists climbed the tower steps, stopping to listen to the bell that had carried the tenor's silent vigil for more than 70 years. They would stand beneath it, heads tilted upward, imagining the man who sought perfection, who pursued sound into the heavens, who believed that music was not merely performed, but lived. Time as always moved forward. But the mystery that once lingered over the city had finally been resolved. Silence had given way to truth, and truth, in its gentle yet devastating clarity, offered the closure so long denied. The bell still tolls over Lyon. But now each note carries memory as well as sound. And the city remembers Étienne Morel not as a ghost, not as a cold case, but as a man who loved deeply, sang fiercely, and rested unknowingly within the heartbeat of the place he cherished most.